welcome to Billy's Books. We're going to do another book. It's a history book this time. Nathaniel Philbrick's Valiant Ambition, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and the Fate of the American Revolution. So this is really a story about Benedict Arnold and everybody else. And of course George Washington played an important role. As you may know, Benedict Arnold was one of Washington's most favored generals. He was reliable, he had courage, and he had a bit of a he was able to win where others did not win. Benedict Arnold, that's the name. When you think Benedict Arnold, you think, hey, good general, Washington's buddy, right? Okay, so this basically is this is actually a pretty sympathetic book to Benedict Arnold. I'm going to go down. I'm just going to tell you some interesting battles. Benedict Arnold was a really good soldier, in the sense that he was courageous and kind of like a lot of the other. He was like George Washington. He preferred to charge in rather than wait, and he was a man of action and stuff. But he unfortunately got promoted. Other people got promoted over him. People who were less competent and more in the fold with Congress, I guess. Anyway, I'm going to go back a little bit. So in 1776, you know, when the Revolution first happened, we didn't have the French. We just had ourselves, and it was rough. So Washington had to retreat to downtown New York from Brooklyn after losing the Battle of Long Island. And he lost the Battle of Long Island. There were two British officers, Admiral Howe and General Howe, who were brothers, and they worked together pretty well usually. And the Howes got Washington's army out of Brooklyn, and they retreated to Manhattan. And then they had to go, and the HMS Eagle was one of Admiral Howe's boats. I think it might even have been the flagship. They tried to sink it in New York Harbor by using the first ever military submarine called the Turtle, which was just this sort of enclosed ball with a crank for paddling, and it had a bunch of explosives in it. And the idea was to bring it up, drill a hole into the bottom of the boat, stick in the explosives, and then paddle away underwater. It didn't work, but it is an interesting first military submarine back in the 18th century. After a while, the Admiral and General Howe met. A lot of these guys wanted peace, right? The Howes believed in peace. They thought that, well, we can resolve this with the colonists with just some good negotiation. And they didn't know that the revolutionaries really want independence. So when the Howes met with Adams, Frank, another guy named Rutledge for peace, it didn't work out. Howe they loved America and they thought it was great, but he wasn't a very good negotiator. He was a military man, so that didn't work out. And Adams and Franklin were like, oh no, we really want independence. It's just a matter of whether we can do it peacefully or not. If you don't want peace, we're going to keep fighting. You're not going to like it either way, but that's the way of independence. George Washington is known for being very stoic. He was not always stoic. He learned to be stoic after a lot of screw-ups. I mean, stoic in the sense of battle. Of course, he was stoic personally, but that was not because he was just a reasonably reserved person. It was because he had all these passions inside, and he had to control them. So when they eventually the Americans were up a little bit further in Manhattan, and the British invaded in the East River over on Kip's Bay, and when they sort of bombarded and then attacked and then landed, and the Americans all were freaking out, and they just all scattered. George Washington came down on his horse, and he was like, "What the hell is wrong with you people?" And he started screaming really irrationally. And word got around that he lost his cool because they were losing, and he was embarrassed about that later. But at the same time, he was also like really frustrated because these men weren't, doing their training. So Kip's Bay was another boom, another disaster. Benedict Arnold was an experienced merchant before the war, an experienced merchant sailor, which meant that he knew he not only was he a good soldier, but he was also a good sailor. So he could have been in the Navy. He was charismatic and wealthy and a very, very enthusiastic, righteous patriot. That's an important thing to realize. At the beginning of the war, Benedict Arnold was really, really very much on the American side because he felt all the things that everybody else felt about the British Empire. At the same time, Benedict Arnold was vain, sensitive to slights, and if you disagreed with him, he would mock you and sneer and all sorts of... He was either beloved or hated, depending on, I guess, how you interacted with him in the past. So George Washington loved him. And there were a bunch of New Englanders, as we call, Samuel Adams and his brother John Adams, or cousin John Adams or whatever, they really didn't like him, and they didn't trust him, and they preferred this guy Horatio Gates, who was the commander of the Northern Army. There were three of them: the Northern Army, Southern Army, and the Maine Army, which Washington was in charge of. But the Northern Army was in charge. Was led by Horatio Gates. And he was one of those guys who was a good administrator and always directed battles from behind. Whereas Washington and Benedict Arnold, and arguably, when given the chance, Hamilton and Lafayette, they would all lead the charge. Gates would lead from behind. And that's an important difference. And of course, there was a lot of criticism. It's a lot of undermining. This book is a lot about people undermining Americans, undermining other Americans, and also at the same time British generals undermining each other as well. Not the Howe brothers undermining each other, but other British admirals and generals would just ignore orders and they did the same thing. The American side did the same thing. If they didn't like an order, they would just ignore it, act like they didn't get it. So a lot of people would ignore George Washington's orders, even though he was the commander-in-chief. And that caused, let's just say it caused some problems. So Benedict Arnold, while out in the field, he was accused of embezzlement in Philadelphia, which was the capital before it was taken by the Brits, and he was unable to defend his reputation. There was a battle up in New York State, the Battle of Lake Champlain, which later led to the Battle of Saratoga, and he was the Commodore of the Mosquito Fleet. So what was the Mosquito Fleet? Well, Lake Champlain is a long vertical lake that is north of where the Hudson River comes by. And the British were on the top and the Americans were at the bottom. And the British were coming down from Canada. The idea was to come down from Canada and up the Hudson from New York and make a big line to distinguish between New England, to cut a line between New England and the rest of the colonies, and that was their strategic plan, which they never really quite achieved. But so the Mosquito Fleet was suddenly the American Navy had sailed built some small boats, and the British built this enormous boat just to be in Lake Champlain. They built it on the fly just so they could come down and crush the Americans, and that was an interesting battle, which you'll have to read all about. The British frigate was called the Inflexible. They built the whole thing in 1 month, and at one point, there's a battle in the same area. The Valcour Island is a little tiny island that's in that vertical section, and the Brits were sailing down, and the Americans were hiding behind this little tiny island, waiting for the Brits to sail past, so then they could come afterwards and attack them from upwind or up whatever. And that was an interesting story as well. You'll have to check that one out in the book. So yes, so the Continental Congress promoted other inferior generals over Benedict Arnold. And one of the reasons apparently wasn't just collusion, but it was also that each state had to have a quota. It was a dumb rule. Benedict Arnold's state, whatever it was now, I don't even remember, already had their quota, so they couldn't promote him. Dumb. Yes, so the other states that didn't have anybody good promoted someone milquetoast instead. And so Benedict Arnold resented that, and they flaunted it in his face to make it worse. Benedict Arnold has been shot. He's known for getting horses shot under him. One day he got 2 horses shot at him on the same day. He gets shot in the hip, and he has to spend a whole winter in excruciating pain. And I think that may have been because he was hearing about all this while he was in this extreme pain, and he was, he can become an angry, passionate man, and he was angry and passionate while embedded. He'd still been denied. He'd been denied his promotion. He's been denied opportunities to fight, and even when he does fight, sometimes there was one battle where he wasn't even given an army, and so he was like just walking around the camp all pissed, and he said he got really upset and perhaps drank or did some opium or something, we don't know, and just said screw it and just charged right into battle anyway. And some of the people who loved him followed him in, and the battle that Gates was losing, guess what? Benedict Arnold won it for him, and then Gates got all the credit. And it happens again and again, and he kept on not getting promoted. So anyway, they finally did promote him while he was in a hospital bed, but he didn't find out for months. So he was sitting there stewing angrily about not being promoted for months before he found out he had been promoted. And I have a feeling it might have been too late at that point because he was so furious.
Well, even though Benedict Arnold wasn't fully healed, he went to joined George Washington in the field. He was still all injured and kind of useless, but insisted on fighting, so George had to figure out what to do with that. Anyway, he had the epaulets on his shoulder because he made it to full general, and he swore on the Bible that he was going to protect the Union. Ultimately, he did not switch sides while in pain because he finally got promoted. And then he became governor of Philadelphia, which he didn't do very well. But his need for money outweighed everything, and he had his new young, beautiful wife was very manipulative, and she was a loyalist. That had something to do with both for her political reasons and money to take care of her. But ultimately, this is a story of take care of your people. Take care, if you have really good soldiers, you should take care of them. Don't treat people like crap, because they may turn on you if you treat them like crap too long.
A little backstory, the George Washington, back before the Revolution, was also denied promotion by the British Army. They said, well, you're a colonist, so you can't go any higher, and that was one of the things that turned him and to the American side. So, something to think about. So it's a very sympathetic book, as it were, and the undermining of other generals at the risk of the cause of the war is pretty upsetting to read. But it is a really good book. It's a real page turner. I'm halfway through it because you know me, I don't like to tell the ending.
I'm going to read this passage to you. Arnold's court-martial had been rescheduled for later that month. If the trial did not go well, it was possible that he might suffer a fate similar to General Charles Lee's and be suspended or even cashiered from the army. Even if he was found guilty of just one of the charges, Washington might not be willing to award him the kind of command that would afford him the access and intelligence the British required of him. A new sense of urgency entered Arnold's preparations for the court-martial. He must not only exonerate himself, he must emerge from the proceeding triumphant. His future as a traitor depended on it. Once the cloak and dagger stuff starts happening, it's pretty exciting. I definitely recommend this book. It's a real page turner once Arnold goes bad. Also, the tone and sympathy for him really changes in the book as well. One more quote. This one should be a good synopsis for a lot of things. Being a republic, the country they were struggling to create was ruled not by a king or an emperor, but by the mutual consent of the governed. Arnold had betrayed not just Washington, but every American citizen he had pledged to protect. Since republics rely on the inherent virtue of the people, they are exceedingly fragile. All it takes is one well-placed person to destroy everything. Washington, his face betraying his sadness, anger, and shock at this most recent revelation, turned to Lafayette and asked, Whom can we trust now? If you can't do, review.